I apologize for the confusion. You're right, I should have started the adaptation right away. Let me begin the translation and adaptation as requested. On the 50th floor of the most imposing building on Wall Street, Edward Thompson gazed at New York City through the enormous windows of his office. At 65, the president of Thompson Group had built a financial empire that made him one of the most powerful men in the country. The reflection in the glass revealed a face marked by time and difficult decisions, piercing green eyes that no longer shone as they once did. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from his only daughter, Helen. "Dad, we need to talk about the exhibition. It's important." Edward sighed, leaving the message unanswered like so many others. Helen, at 32, had followed a completely different path than he had dreamed. Instead of taking over as vice president of the group, she had dedicated herself to art, becoming a respected restorer and curator. "Mr. Thompson, the board meeting will begin in 5 minutes, announced Sarah, his assistant for over 2 decades. She knew every nuance of the boss's mood, every important decision that shaped the empire, and especially the price he paid for it all. In the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. Richard Vance, his right-hand man for 30 years, presented the numbers for the last quarter. The stocks fell 12% after the leak of information about the possible merger with Almeida Group. "We need a damage control strategy." Edward remained impassive, but inside his blood was boiling. The leak could only have come from someone in the inner circle. His eyes scanned the table, studying each face present. Among them was Charles Montgomery, a former partner who had lost a large part of his shares in a controversial corporate maneuver years ago. Now, as a minority shareholder, he remained an uncomfortable presence at meetings. "Gentlemen," Edward stood up, his deep voice filling the room, "over 40 years, I built this group with determination and sacrifices. I will not allow speculation and internal betrayals to threaten everything we've achieved. The person responsible for the leak will be identified and face the consequences." After the meeting in his office, Edward received an unexpected call. It was Barbara, his ex-wife and Helen's mother. "Edward, you can't keep ignoring our daughter. The exhibition she's organizing is the realization of a dream. She needs you there." "Barbara, I have a crisis to manage. Helen chose her path against my wishes. She has her own money now." "It's not about money, Edward. It never was. It's about presence, about love. Something you've always confused with zeros in the bank account." Barbara's words hit him like precise arrows. Deep down, he knew she was right. His obsession with the empire had cost him his 25-year marriage and his relationship with his daughter. Helen had grown up seeing her father only at rare dinners and social events, always interrupted by urgent work calls. That night, alone in his penthouse in Manhattan, Edward opened a bottle of aged whiskey, a gift from Helen on his last birthday. Next to the bottle was a card he had never read. "Dad, every drop of this whiskey took years to reach perfection. Like our relationship, perhaps it needs time to mature. With love, Helen." His thoughts were interrupted by his cell phone. It was an anonymous email with an attached file. As he opened it, his face paled. There were internal company documents, confidential contracts, and compromising emails that could destroy his reputation if they became public. At the end of the message, a phrase, "Your fortress has cracks, Edward, and they're deeper than you imagine." The empire he had built was beginning to show its fragilities. Like a glass castle, it would take just one precise blow for everything to shatter. Edward poured himself more whiskey, observing the city lights through the window. Somewhere out there, someone knew his darkest secrets and was about to use them against him. What Edward didn't know was that the threat wasn't just coming from his declared enemies. The shadows of the past were about to emerge, bringing with them long-buried truths. And Helen, unknowingly, was at the center of a plot that would shake the foundations not only of the financial empire, but of the entire Thompson family. Helen Thompson's studio, located in an old brownstone in Brooklyn, was her true home. The exposed brick walls housed canvases in various stages of restoration, each telling its own story. That morning, she was bent over a 19th-century work, carefully removing layers of varnish darkened by time when her assistant, Julia, rushed. Helen, you need to see this." Julia extended the tablet with the front page of the country's largest news portal. The headline made her heart sink. "Thompson Empire under suspicion. Documents reveal possible irregularities in million-dollar A-sway mergers." Her hands trembled slightly, staining the sleeve of her work apron with solvent. Helen knew this feeling well, the mixture of concern and frustration that always accompanied crises involving her father. But this time, something seemed different, more personal. "I've already tried calling him," she said, putting down the brush. "As always, I got Sarah's voicemail." Helen walked to the large studio window, observing the street movement. Her exhibition, Fragments of Memory, would open in 2 weeks at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It would be her greatest professional achievement to date, a curation that blended works she had restored with pieces of her own authorship. The phone rang. It was Mary Montgomery, her best friend since childhood and daughter of Charles Montgomery, her father's former partner. "Lena, have you heard? Dad's been in an emergency meeting at the bank since early morning. Something big is happening." "Mary, I need to tell you something." Helen hesitated. "Last night I received a strange email. Old photos from when we were kids, me, you, our parents. Along with it was a message. Some stories need to be restored, just like your canvases." On the other end of the line, Mary was silent for a few seconds. "Do you remember Clarissa, the housekeeper who worked for your family?" The name hit Helen like lightning. Clarissa had been much more than an employee. She was practically a second mother during her childhood, until she suddenly disappeared when Helen was 12 years old. Her father never explained why, and over time she learned not to ask questions about it. "Mary, why are you mentioning Clarissa now?" "Because she approached my father a few weeks ago. Apparently she has documents, Helen. Documents that might explain why she really left your house." Helen sat down, feeling the weight of the memories. She remembered the breakfasts prepared by Clarissa, the bedtime stories, the hugs on days when her father cancelled yet another family plan, and then the inexplicable void of her departure. "There's one more thing," Mary continued. "Clarissa isn't alone in this story. She has a daughter, Helen, a daughter that no one ever knew existed." The studio suddenly seemed too small. Helen walked to a specific canvas covered by a cloth. It was her most personal work to be revealed. At the exhibition, a fragmented self-portrait where each piece told a part of her story. Now she realized there were blank spaces that even she didn't understand. Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was an unknown number. "True works of art are made of layers, Helen. Some need to be removed to reveal what's underneath. I'll be waiting for you today at 7 p.m. at the Blue Note Jazz Club. Come alone. C." As the afternoon progressed, Helen knew she was at a crossroads. Going to the meeting meant diving into a past that might be better left buried. Not going meant continuing to live with the doubts that had always haunted her life. Julia watched her boss with concern. "Helen, are you okay? You look pale." "Julia, I need you to take over the studio for the rest of the day," Helen said, removing her apron. "I have an important meeting." As she prepared to leave, Helen looked once more at her covered self-portrait. As a restorer, she knew that sometimes it was necessary to descend to the deepest layers of a work to save it. Perhaps it was time to do the same with her own story. The Blue Note Jazz Club maintained its 1950s elegance, with its antique mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Helen arrived punctually at 7 p.m., choosing a discreet table at the back of the establishment. Her restless hands rotated the untouched coffee cup, while her eyes studied each person who entered. Exactly at 7:15 p.m., an elegant woman of about 60 years old walked through the club. Helen recognized her instantly, even after 2 decades. Clarissa maintained the same proud posture, her now grey hair tied in an impeccable bun, and that look that always seemed to carry a million secrets. "Helen," Clarissa smiled softly, sitting down. "You're the image of your mother at your age." "Why?" "Now, Clarissa." Helen was direct, her emotions oscillating between anger and relief. 20 years of silence, and suddenly you reappear just when my father is facing a crisis?" Clarissa took a brown envelope from her bag and placed it on the table. Because some truths have their own time of maturation, dear. Like those canvases. You restore. Sometimes you need to wait for the right moment to reveal what's hidden. Inside the envelope, Helen found old photographs. The first showed a young Clarissa holding a baby next to Edward Thompson. In the next photo, two little girls played in the garden of the Thompson mansion. Helen recognized herself, but the other child. "Her name is Laura," Clarissa said softly, looking at the photo. "My daughter. Your sister." The world seemed to spin around Helen. "What do you mean, my sister?" "Your father and we had a relationship before he married your mother. Laura was born from that relationship. Edward promised he would take care of us, that he would keep his daughter close, even if no one could know the truth. That's why he hired me as a housekeeper." Helen felt the coffee churning in her stomach. Fragmented memories began to make sense. Clarissa's special attentions, the knowing looks between her and her father, the girl who occasionally appeared to play, introduced as a staff member's daughter. What happened? Why did you disappear? "Barbara, your mother discovered the truth. Edward had to choose. Either I left with Laura or he risked losing everything, the family, the reputation, the empire he was building. He gave us a considerable amount to start over far away, on the condition that we never get close again. And now, why come back and expose all this?" "Because Laura is sick, Helen. She needs a bone marrow transplant, and you might be compatible. I tried to contact your father, but he refuses to help us. The documents that leaked about his business, it was the only way we found to get attention." Helen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "Are you telling me that you have a sister who needs my help, and that you're blackmailing my father to get it?" "No, Helen. I'm saying that your sister needs you and that your father prefers to see his empire crumble than publicly admit her existence." At that moment, Helen spotted Richard Vance, her father's right-hand man, entering the club. Their eyes met, and she realized he wasn't there by chance. "We need to go," Clarissa quickly stood up. "There's much more you need to know, but not here, not now." Leaving through the back of the club, through the kitchen, Helen felt like she was in one of the suspense movies she used to watch. But this was her real life, and the revelations of that night were just the tip of an iceberg of family secrets. "Meet me tomorrow at my studio," Helen whispered to Clarissa as they parted. "Bring Laura. If this is really true, she's my sister. And family is more important than any empire." As she drove back home, Helen couldn't hold back the tears. Her phone rang insistently. They were calls from her father, who probably already knew about the meeting. But she didn't answer. For the first time, she felt she was about to discover her true story, not the one her father had so carefully constructed over the years. In her apartment, Helen spent the night awake, looking at old family photos with different eyes. In each image, she searched for signs, clues that might have denounced the truth that had been in front of her throughout her childhood. A truth that, like the paintings she restored, was hidden under layers and layers of carefully preserved appearances. Edward Thompson didn't sleep that night. In his office in the penthouse, reports on the document leak piled up on the desk, but his thoughts were at the Blue Note Jazz Club, where Richard had confirmed the meeting between Helen and Clarissa. His world was beginning to crumble, not because of the leaked documents or falling stocks, but because of the past that insisted on resurfacing. "Sarah, cancel my morning appointments," he said on the phone, his voice hoarse from the sleepless. "Tight? And try to locate Barbara. Tell her it's urgent." While waiting, Edward accessed a safe hidden behind a painting, an abstract canvas that Helen had painted at 15. From there, he retrieved a yellowed envelope. Inside, besides old photos, there was a contract, the document that had sealed his agreement with Clarissa 20 years ago, ensuring her silence in exchange for a comfortable life away from New York. The intercom buzzed. It was Barbara. Even after the divorce, she kept a key to the apartment, courtesy of the years of coexistence and their daughter in common. "You knew this would happen one day, Edward," Barbara said as she entered without preamble. "No amount of money would be enough to keep this secret forever. Did you come to judge me, Barbara? No, I came because despite everything, you're still the father of my daughter, and Helen is suffering. Edward poured himself a drink, offering another to his ex-wife, who declined with a gesture. When you found out about Clarissa and Laura, why didn't you expose me? Why did you agree to keep the secret? For Helen, Barbara answered, sitting down. She was already suffering so much. From your absence, Edward. Imagine if she found out that the father she barely saw had another family. No, I chose to protect her, but now she's a woman, and she deserves to know the truth. Edward's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Charles Montgomery. Extraordinary board meeting called for this afternoon. The shareholders are in panic. The empire is crumbling. Edward muttered, more to himself than to Barbara. Everything I've built on lies, Edward, on lives that you manipulated like chess pieces. Clarissa, Laura, Helen, me. We were all sacrificed for your precious empire. At that moment, Richard Vance rushed into the office. Edward, we have a bigger problem. The press has discovered about Laura. In an hour, her existence will be headline news on all portals. Edward felt the weight of 2 decades of secrets crashing down on his shoulders. How? Someone sent the old photos to the newspapers. Photos of you with Clarissa, with the girl, DNA, birth certificate, everything. Barbara stood up, picking up her purse. You know, Edward, for years I wondered how you managed to sleep at night, carrying so many secrets. Now I realize that you never really slept. You just existed, a prisoner of your own lies. When he was alone, Edward walked to the balcony. The sun was rising over New York, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. Ironically, he remembered Helen once commenting on how those colors would be perfect for a canvas. His daughter, the artist he never understood, always saw beauty where he only saw numbers. His cell phone rang again. It was Helen. Dad, her voice was firm on the other end of the line. Clarissa and Laura are here in my studio. I think it's time we had a family conversation. All parts of the family. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that decision. In a few hours, his business empire could crumble, but for the first time in decades, that wasn't what concerned him most. It was the possibility of losing Helen definitively. Daughter, I don't want explanations over the phone, Helen interrupted him. Come here. Laura needs help, Dad. And I need to know who I really am, who we really are. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Finally, Edward answered, I'm on my way. As he went down to the garage, Edward received one more message. It was an anonymous email, with just one line. Some fortunes are built with money. Others are destroyed by secrets. Which one do you choose to preserve? Helen's studio had never seemed so small as it did that morning. The light streaming through the large windows illuminated the canvases in restoration, creating shadows that danced across the exposed brick walls. In a corner, covered by a white cloth, stood her unfinished self-portrait, a work that now gained new meanings. Laura was sitting on one of the high stools, her pale hands holding a cup of tea. At 32, she had the same penetrating green eyes as Edward, the same facial structure as Helen. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, an alternative version of herself that Helen never knew existed. Do you paint too? Helen asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. Actually, I'm a pianist, Laura replied with a shy smile. I teach at a conservatory in Boston, or I did until... Her voice faltered, and Clarissa, who was by her side, squeezed her hand in support. The sound of the studio door opening interrupted the moment. Edward Thompson entered, seeming to have aged decades in a single night. Behind him, to everyone's surprise, came Barbara. I thought it better to come along, Barbara explained, exchanging a meaningful look with Helen. Some conversations need all voices to make sense. The silence that followed was dense, laden with 2 decades of secrets and unspoken words. It was Laura who broke it. It didn't have to be like this, she said, looking directly at Edward. All this time, this money spent to keep us away. For what? To protect your reputation? Your empire? Edward took a few hesitant steps towards The daughter he had denied for so long. His hands trembled slightly. "Laura, I didn't come here to demand explanations for the past," Laura interrupted him. "I came because I need help, and because Helen deserved to know the truth." Helen walked to her covered self-portrait and removed the cloth. The canvas revealed her face fragmented into various pieces, some clear, others blurred, some completely blank. "Come see this," she called. Everyone approached the painting. This painting was to be the centerpiece of my exhibition. I called it Fragmented Identity because I always felt there were parts of my story that didn't make sense. Now I understand. Why? "It's beautiful," Laura commented, her eyes misting, "and sad." "Like our story," Helen completed. "Dad, look at this canvas. Look at us. Two sisters who could have grown up together, shared dreams, supported each other. Instead, you chose to separate us. Why?" Edward touched the canvas gently, his fingers tracing the fragmented lines. "Because I'm a coward," he admitted, his voice choked. "Because I built my entire life on the image of an infallible man, an emperor of business, and I was so afraid of losing that I ended up losing something much more precious, the chance to be a true father." Barbara, who had been observing the scene in silence, approached. "Edward, you can still fix this. Not everything, but enough to make a difference now." "The newspapers already know," he said. "In a few hours, the whole country will know. The board is in panic, stocks plummeting." "So what?" Helen exploded. "Laura needs a bone marrow transplant. Your daughter is sick, Dad. Your daughter. And you're still worried about stocks and boards?" Edward looked at Laura. Really looked, perhaps for the first time in 20 years. He saw in her not just the fruit of a past mistake, but a young woman, an artist like Helen, someone who carried his blood and who now needed him more than any shareholder or board member. "You're right," he finally said. "You're all right." He turned to Clarissa. "Forgive me. For everything." "It's not just me you owe forgiveness to, Edward," Clarissa responded. "It's them. All of them." At that moment, Edward's cell phone rang insistently. It was Richard. The first headlines were beginning to appear on news portals. The Thompson empire was in flames, but for the first time in his life, Edward turned off the phone. "We'll solve this," he said, looking at Laura. "First, we'll take care of you. Then we face the rest." Helen approached Laura, taking her hand. "We're sisters. We should have known this a long time ago, but now we know, and I'll be by your side every step of the way from now on." The morning sun now fully flooded the studio, illuminating Helen's fragmented self-portrait. In its shadows and lights, the painting seemed to come to life as if the pieces were finally starting to fit together. The headlines dominated all news outlets. "Billionaire Edward Thompson has secret daughter revealed." "Financial empire in each crisis after family revelations. Thompson Group stocks plummet 30% in a single day." But inside Mount Sinai Hospital, where Laura was undergoing her tests, none of that seemed to matter. Helen watched her sister through the laboratory glass as doctors collected samples for the compatibility test. It was surreal how in just 3 days her life had completely changed. Her cell phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, friends, acquaintances, all wanting to know more about the secret sister. "You didn't have to cancel the exhibition," Laura commented as she left the lab. "Your work shouldn't be affected because of all this." "I didn't cancel," Helen smiled, "just postponed, and I'm going to make some modifications. That fragmented self-portrait, now it will have a twin sister next to it." The two walked to the hospital cafeteria where Barbara was waiting for them. Edward's ex-wife had become an unexpected ally in these turbulent days. "How were the tests?" "We'll have the results in a week," Laura replied. "But the doctor said the chances of compatibility between sisters are good." On the other side of the city, at Thompson Group headquarters, Edward faced the biggest crisis of his career. The board of directors was in permanent session, and shareholders were demanding his immediate resignation. "It's a matter of trust, Edward," argued Charles Montgomery, now his main opponent on the board. "How can we trust a man who hid a daughter for 20 years? What other secrets are you still hiding?" Edward, for the first time in his business life, wasn't interested in fighting. Gentlemen, for decades I put this empire above everything. Above ethics, above family, above love. Today, for the first time, I have clarity on what really matters. Richard Vance, seated beside him, handed him an envelope. The documents you asked for, Edward. Are you sure about this? Absolutely, he replied, opening the envelope and starting to sign the papers one by one. As of today, I'm transferring 30% of my shares to a trust fund in Laura's name. Another 30% will be transferred to Helen. I'm keeping just enough to ensure a seat on the board. The room exploded in protests, but Edward continued. And one more thing, I'm stepping down from the executive presidency. Richard will assume the position on an interim basis until the board chooses a replacement. Leaving the meeting, Edward headed to Sarah's office, his faithful assistant for so many years. Sarah, I need you to organize a press conference for tomorrow. It's time to tell my version of the story. Are you sure, Mr. Thompson? The PR team recommends waiting for the dust to settle. No, Sarah, I've waited too long. I've hidden too much. At the hospital, Helen received a call from Julia, her studio assistant. Helen, you won't believe it. Mary Montgomery is here, with some documents that she says are important, something about the time when Clarissa worked for your family. Helen exchanged glances with Laura. We're on our way there. On the way to the studio, the sisters talked about their lives, filling decades of absence with stories, laughter, and some tears. You know what's most ironic, Laura commented. Dad always wanted you to follow in his footsteps in business, while I dreamed of being an artist like you. We ended up following exactly the opposite path to what he planned for each of us. Maybe that's why we're here now, Helen reflected, because we're finally living our own truths, not the truths he constructed for us. When they arrived at the studio, they found Mary anxious. In her hands, an old folder with the Thompson Group letterhead. You need to see this, she said. I found it in my father's office. They're documents from when Clarissa left, and there's something that will change everything you think you know about this story. The sun was setting in New York, painting the sky with shades of gold and red. In Helen's studio, another layer of the past was about to be revealed, like an old canvas hidden under decades of varnish. In the yellowish light of the studio, Mary opened the old folder on Helen's restoration table. The smell of old paper mingled with the aroma of paints and solvents. Laura and Helen leaned over the documents, while Clarissa remained slightly apart, as if fearing what those pages might reveal. They're letters, Mary explained, exchanged between my father and Edward at the time Clarissa left. But there's more than that. There's an agreement, signed by all the group's partners at the time, including my father. Helen began to read aloud. By mutual agreement between the parties, it is established that Clarissa Roberts and her daughter Laura will receive lifelong financial support on the condition that they maintain distance from New York and the Thompson family. We already knew that, Laura interrupted. That was the agreement Dad made to keep us away. Keep reading, Mary insisted. Helen continued, her eyes widening as she absorbed the words. In return, Charles Montgomery commits to not revealing his participation in the group's fund misappropriation scheme executed between 1990 and 1995 under penalty of... My God, Laura whispered. So it wasn't just to protect his reputation. There was more at stake. Clarissa finally approached. I always knew there was something more. Edward was never a man who cared that much about personal scandals. But Charles Montgomery was always behind everything. Mary picked up another document from the folder. Here's the proof. My father not only knew about Laura, he used this information to blackmail Edward for years. Clarissa and Laura's departure wasn't Edward's decision. It was my father's demand. Helen sat down, feeling the weight of that revelation. That's why Dad always seemed so bitter. He didn't just lose a daughter and someone he loved, he was forced to give them up. But why? Laura questioned. Why would your father do this, Mary? Because he was involved in a scheme to misappropriate funds from the group, Mary explained, her voice trembling. If Edward revealed the truth about it, my father would go to jail, so he used Laura's secret as a guarantee of silence. Clarissa covered her face with her hands. All these years I blamed Edward. I thought he had abandoned us by choice. And now, Helen asked, what do we do with this information? Laura's cell phone rang. It was Edward. "Dad? Yes, we're all here at the studio. What? You're coming here? But what about the board meeting?" When Laura hung up, her hands were shaking. "He resigned from the group's presidency, said he's coming to tell us the whole truth." Mary hurriedly gathered the documents. "I need to go. My father can't know I found this. He's not the man." "I thought he was." "Stay," Helen asked, holding her friend's hand. "You deserve to hear the truth too, we all do." The sound of footsteps on the studio stairs made everyone turn to the door. Edward entered, looking strangely at peace for someone who had just given up the empire he had built. "I see you already know," he said, noticing the documents on the table. "Mary, your presence here. I imagine it was you who found the papers." "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. I couldn't let this lie continue." Edward approached Clarissa, his eyes watery. "I never wanted you to leave. I never wanted to separate Laura from her sister. But Charles, he had evidence of the misappropriations that happened at the beginning of the group. If I didn't accept his conditions, it wouldn't just be my ruin, but hundreds of employees, shareholders." "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Clarissa asked, her voice choked. "Because Charles made it clear that if you knew the real reason, he would make everything public. It was better for you to hate me than to put you and Laura at risk." Helen hugged her father, for the first time in years feeling that she truly knew that man. "And now? What happens?" "Now?" Edward smiled sadly. "Now the truth comes out. All truths. Tomorrow I'll give a press conference, not just about Laura, but about everything. The misappropriations, the blackmail, Charles's role." "This will destroy my father," Mary murmured. "Yes," Edward agreed. "But sometimes you need to destroy to rebuild, and it's time we rebuilt this family on true foundations." Laura approached her father, touching his face affectionately. "You're giving up everything." "No, daughter. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing what really matters." The sun had completely set, and the city lights began to shine through the studio windows. On the easel, Helen's fragmented self-portrait seemed to observe that scene. A family that, like a work of art damaged by time, finally began its restoration process. The auditorium at Thompson Group headquarters was packed with journalists. Cameras, microphones, and flashes pointed at the main table, where Edward Thompson prepared for his most important statement. Surprisingly, Helen and Laura were at his side. Clarissa occupied a chair in the front row next to Barbara. "Good morning, everyone," Edward began, his voice firm despite the visible tension on his face. "I called this press conference not only to confirm the rumors about my daughter Laura, but to reveal a story that has remained hidden for 2 decades. A story of wrong choices, blackmail, and redemption." In the back rows, Mary Montgomery observed everything, her heart torn between loyalty to her father and commitment to the truth. Charles Montgomery had tried to prevent her from coming, but she needed to witness this moment. "Laura is not a shameful secret I tried to hide," Edward continued. "She is my daughter as much as Helen, and the biggest mistake of my life was allowing us to be separated. But this separation was not just my decision." The journalists leaned forward as Edward began to reveal the details about Charles Montgomery's blackmail. Helen, seated next to her father, held Laura's hand, both facing the camera flashes and growing murmur together. "The documents that prove all these accusations," Edward went on, "are being delivered at this moment to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the appropriate authorities. Yes, this will mean the end of many careers, possibly including mine, but my daughter Laura needs a bone marrow transplant, and I will not allow any more secrets or threats to keep us apart." At the back of the auditorium, Richard Vance was receiving frantic messages from board members. The group's stocks were plummeting even further, and rumors of a judicial intervention were beginning to circulate. A journalist raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, are you willing to lose everything? The empire you built over decades?" Edward looked at his daughters before answering. "I already lost everything once when I allowed my family to be separated. What you call an empire, I call a prison I built with my own hands, made of secrets and regrets." Laura took the microphone, surprising everyone. "I grew up believing that my father had abandoned us by choice. Today I know that he was also a victim of a system of blackmail and power. I'm not here to judge the past, but to build a future where I no longer need to hide. Helen also wanted to speak. My exhibition at the Met, which was postponed, will now have a new meaning. It will be a celebration not just of art but of truth, of the restoration not only of old canvases, but of family ties that seemed lost forever. In the front row, Clarissa cried silently, while Barbara held her hand in support. 20 years of hurt began to dissipate, replaced by a deeper understanding of the circumstances that had separated them. After the press conference in Edward's office, the family gathered in a moment of intimacy. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, lawyers, shareholders, journalists, but for the first time Edward let all the calls go to voicemail. The compatibility test results come out tomorrow, Laura commented, breaking the silence. No matter the result, Helen responded. We're a family now, we'll face this together. Edward observed his daughters with a mixture of pride and regret. You two are so much stronger than I ever was. I spent my life building walls to protect an empire, when I should have been building bridges to protect what really mattered. Mary entered the office, her eyes red from crying. My father has just been removed from the board. He wants to talk to you, Edward. Not today, Edward responded softly. Today is for family, for healing. The consequences can wait until tomorrow. As the sun set over New York, casting golden shadows through the office windows, that small group of people began to understand that sometimes you need to lose everything to gain what really matters. The financial empire might be crumbling, but something much more valuable was being built on its ruins, a true family, united not by secrets and obligations but by love and truth. The doctor's office was silent when Dr. Richardson entered with the test results. Helen and Laura were sitting side by side, their hands intertwined, while Edward and Clarissa waited standing, each in a corner of the room like distant planets now forced into a new orbit. The results are positive, announced the doctor, a gentle smile on his face. Helen is a 100% match for the bone marrow donation. Laura covered her face with her hands, letting the tears flow freely. Helen hugged her, feeling as if the entire universe had conspired to unite them even more. See, we really are sisters. In every cell, she joked, trying to lighten the emotional moment. As the doctor explained the procedures and scheduled the surgery date, Edward observed his daughters. In his pocket, the envelope Richard had delivered earlier weighed heavily, the official notification of his removal from the presidency of Thompson Group. The empire was officially lost, but for the first time in decades, he felt truly rich. Later, that day in Helen's studio, preparations for the exhibition were taking shape. Julia and a team of assistants were organizing the restored works, while Helen worked on 2 new canvases. Her self-portrait now had a companion. It's incredible how much you two look alike, Barbara commented, observing the new painting Helen was working on, a portrait of Laura at the piano, her fingers hovering over imaginary keys, her face illuminated by a light that seemed to come from within. I'm calling this series Soul Mirrors, Helen explained, applying another layer of paint. They're 2 canvases that converse with each other, a restorer and a pianist, 2 artists separated by time, but united by blood. Mary Montgomery entered the studio carrying more documents. After the press conference, she had become a tireless ally, helping to reconstruct the true story of the family. I found more things in my father's office, she said. Old photographs, from before everything happened. I thought you might want to see them. The photos showed moments that seemed to belong to another life. A young Edward and Clarissa, smiling at a picnic in Central Park, baby Helen being held by a 3-year-old Laura, the 2 girls playing in the garden of the Thompson mansion. I remember that day, Clarissa murmured, touching one of the photos delicately. It was Laura's 4th birthday. Helen had just learned to walk. That's why I always felt an inexplicable void, Helen reflected. Even without knowing, part of me remembered. The body holds memories that the mind forgets. Laura approached, the easel where her unfinished portrait stood. Is this how you see me, sis? This is how you are, Helen replied. Strong, luminous, full of music inside. even in the most difficult moments. Edward, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. "You two are the best part of me, the part I almost lost out of fear, pride, cowardice." "It wasn't just your fault, Edward," Clarissa intervened. "We were all pieces in a game bigger than ourselves, but now we can choose to play differently." Helen's phone rang. It was the Met confirming the new date for the exhibition, 2 weeks from now. "It will be right after your surgery," she said to Laura. "Do you think you'll be well enough to go?" "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Laura smiled. "Besides, I need to be there to see people's faces when they discover that Edward Thompson's mysterious daughter is actually a piano teacher who hates the corporate world as much as her sister does." Everyone laughed, and for a moment the studio seemed to fill with a different light, not the golden light of the setting sun outside, but a light that came from the people, from the stories being rewritten, from the bonds being restored. Barbara approached Edward, who was watching his daughters talking. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes we lose everything to gain what really matters." "You were always the wisest of us, Barbara," he replied. "You always knew that true value wasn't in stock numbers or financial reports." On the studio wall, the two portraits, Helen fragmented and Laura at the piano, seemed to dialogue in silence, telling a story of separation and reunion, of pain and healing, of secrets revealed and truths finally accepted. It was the story of a family that, like the works of art Helen restored, needed to be taken apart to be rebuilt, stronger and truer than before. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was packed on the opening night of the Soul Mirrors exhibition. New York's cultural elite mingled with journalists and curious onlookers, all eager to see not only the works restored by Helen Thompson, but especially the two canvases that had generated so much buzz, the sisters' portraits. Laura, still recovering from the transplant performed 2 weeks earlier, was seated in a special chair placed in the gallery. Her face showed fatigue, but her eyes shone with a new intensity. Helen remained by her side, the two sharing complicit smiles as they observed the guests. "It's surreal to see so many people looking at our faces on the walls," Laura commented, adjusting the scarf covering her hair. "It's as if our story has become a work of art. Hasn't it?" Helen smiled. "Sometimes life imitates art, and sometimes art reveals life." Edward entered the hall accompanied by Clarissa. They were no longer the passionate couple from 20 years ago, but there was a new form of affection between them, respect born of forgiveness and understanding. Barbara soon joined the group, bringing glasses of sparkling water for everyone. "Helen," called Julia, approaching hurriedly. "The museum curator wants to start the official tour. You need to give the welcome speech." Helen took a deep breath, squeezing Laura's hand before heading to the center of the hall. The lights were softly dimmed, creating a natural focus on her. "Good evening, everyone," her voice echoed clearly through the room. "This exhibition is called Soul Mirrors for a very special reason. As a restorer, I've learned that each work of art carries multiple layers of history. Sometimes we need to remove layers of dirt and darkened varnish to find the true beauty hidden underneath." Her eyes met her father's as she continued. "Our family went through a similar process. We had to remove layers of secrets, of hurt, of misunderstandings, to find the love that was always there, waiting to be restored." People began to circulate through the exhibition, observing the works restored by Helen, 18th and 19th century canvases that had regained their original splendor. But it was the two central portraits that attracted the most attention. "The resemblance between the sisters is remarkable," commented an art critic, "but even more impressive is how the two works complement each other." Helen's fragmented self-portrait finds its completeness in the serene portrait of Laura at the piano. Mary Montgomery, who was observing everything from a discreet corner, approached Edward. "My father asked me to give you this," she said, extending an envelope. "He didn't have the courage to come, but—" Edward opened the envelope right there. It was a letter from Charles, a complete confession of his actions, taking full responsibility for the blackmail and misappropriations. At the end, a simple request for forgiveness. "Some restorations take longer," Edward murmured, tucking the letter away. "But every painting deserves a chance to regain its original beauty." In the center of the hall, Laura carefully stood up, supported by Helen. The two walked to their portraits, stopping to observe them side by side. "You know what's most incredible?" Laura commented. "You painted my portrait before you really knew me. How did you manage to capture so much truth?" "Maybe because deep down I always knew you existed," Helen replied. "It was an empty space on the canvas of my life, waiting to be filled." Clarissa approached her daughters, enveloping them in an embrace. Barbara and Edward joined them, forming an impromptu circle in the middle of the exhibition. At that moment, they were no longer the family divided by secrets and betrayals. They were just a family, imperfect like all others, but finally complete. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum curator called everyone's attention, "it is with great honor that we announce that the Met is permanently acquiring the two central works of this exhibition. Soul mirrors will be part of our permanent collection, telling future generations a story of love, forgiveness, and restoration." Edward looked at his daughters, at Clarissa, at Barbara, and finally understood. His true legacy wasn't in the mirrored buildings on Wall Street, in the stock market shares, or in newspaper headlines. It was there in that moment, in that group of people who had learned that love, like an ancient work of art, sometimes needs to be rediscovered, restored, and carefully preserved. The night wore on, and guests began to say their goodbyes. Helen and Laura remained in the empty hall, observing their portraits under the soft light of the lamps. "What do you think the future holds for us?" Laura asked. Helen smiled, taking her sister's hand. "I don't know. But for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid to find out, because now we're complete." Outside, New York pulsed with its endless nocturnal energy, but inside the Met, in that gallery where two sisters reunited through art, time seemed suspended. In a perfect moment of harmony, the restoration was complete.